Hey everybody, it's Ferno here, and this is first thing in the morning musings. I had a thought that I wanted to discuss, which is the limitations of utilitarianism. I see this as being applicable to the antinatalism debate. Maybe it's not, you can let me know. But the premise of utilitarianism is that you can express pleasure and pain as a single principle, what Bentham called utility. And the upshot of that, a utilitarian argues, is that you can structure decisions based around maximizing utility. So you can make decisions that reach the greatest pleasure with the minimum pain. And now we can discuss the terms objectively because we have a measure. We can actually apply some kind of a reasoned formula, something that's not just subjective, something that is not just dependent on the individual, but we can formulate policy measuring against utility. And the thing is that we do employ this principle at the global scale and at the national scale. But we see this a lot with things like peace index, happiness index, progress index, freedom index. These are kinds of utility. It follows this line of logic. But of course, these indexes are presented relative to what they're measuring. And they have specific benchmarks that they measure against. So, you have, say, 26 categories that are presented as measurement of peace. And then countries are ranked according to how they fit on the chart. But of course, that's descriptive. It's not proscriptive. And with utilitarianism, we are looking for proscriptive measures, our ability to formulate policy in a way that minimizes suffering, maximizes pleasure. But even if you took the pleasure principle out of it and considered just the minimization of suffering, then I think you could apply the principles of utilitarianism. Now, this works at large scales when you are dealing with cultures, when you're dealing with societies, large swaths of humanity, where it makes sense to introduce policies that can result in suffering, but across the board minimize it. And an example of this comes up quite clearly when you consider the prospects of going to war. If you are in a situation where people are being oppressed, where just walking down the street, doing your daily business, you risk threat to your life from government, from the government, from agents of the state. At what point do you stage a revolution? Or if you represent one country, one collective, and a neighboring country or collective is flexing its military might, committing theft, well, that's an act of violence, and that increases suffering. But at what point do you go to war? At what point do you inflict violence? At what point do you say to your opponent, we are now at a state of war. Violence is now on the table. Because war increases suffering. But at some point, you have to make a decision. And what logic do you employ? And so I think the utilitarian model bears out quite well in those large scales. But at the small scale, the level of individual life, how do you make the decisions that get you through the day? I don't think that this philosophy has any relevance. I don't think it really offers us anything. The primary reason being, in order to compare suffering to pleasure, or even suffering to lack of suffering, there has to be some kind of causal link. So, as a child, we get told, eat your greens or eat whatever it is that you don't want to eat that's on the table. And your mother will say, there's starving children in China, so eat up. But, of course, there's no connection there. The children in China don't starve less if you eat your entire meal or if you chuck the whole thing in the trash. Either way doesn't actually impact their suffering. Just because I have pleasure does not mean that I can reduce the suffering of someone else by decreasing that pressure. Feeling guilt over other people's suffering only adds more suffering to the mix. Although having a sense of responsibility to others collectively puts us in the position of reducing suffering. But there has to be some kind of a causal link. What are you doing? What is it about your pleasure that relates to the suffering of others? So say, for example, if we did away with smartphones, if we went back to just 2G cell phones, or if we weren't replacing our cell phones with more and more sophisticated technologies on a yearly basis, then we may be able to reduce suffering in the countries where the minerals are mined. But not really. And the problem isn't that the minerals are there. The problem isn't that they're mined. The problem is that there is no stable government in those countries to stand up for the people there. There's no collective bargaining for the people who are suffering. That's the problem. The problem isn't that people enjoy playing Angry Birds. It's not that if you stopped playing Angry Birds, that then miners who are being exploited in the Congo would no longer be exploited. So I think that this thinking is really limited. What leads to this asymmetry, that pleasure cannot ever balance out pain. I think the proposition itself is quite ludicrous. There is no asymmetry, there is no symmetry. Pleasure and pain between individuals aren't comparable. Someone else suffering, say loneliness and heartache, I'm not seeing someone right now. Does that invalidate the joy felt by couples who are in happy and committed relationships? Or does it invalidate even the fleeting joy from one-night stands and short-lived romances? Well, no, there's no causal connection. My happiness or joy is largely unaffected by what other people are doing in their personal lives. I mean, unless a guy I despise has hooked up with a girl I adore, then there might be a connection. But if they have happiness, I am only adding to suffering by objecting to it. In which case I would consider, if we're talking about some kind of asymmetry, I would consider it my problem. I would have to limit my suffering because it's something that I'm just making up. So those are my thoughts on that issue. In conclusion, the concept of comparing a pain pleasure principle against each other as some kind of competing matrix works on the large scale, and it doesn't work on the small scale. It doesn't apply to how we live our actual everyday lives. Those are my thoughts.